Good evening, it's a pleasure to be with you here tonight and to talk a little bit about farming within limits. Just to set the scene, I want to just make sure that we're all clear on why we're talking about farming within limits. And so, I appreciate that this is probably obvious for most of you, but just in case, I just want to state that we're talking about the limits that were established by the Saoa Zone Committee, then that progressed through the legal RMA process, with ECAN resulting in public submissions, hearings, recommendation of a hearing panel, appeals, and finally a formal variation to Plan Change 1. So that's what we're talking about, the limits that were established by that process. Who is this Zone Committee and what influence do they have on what's happening? So Alan said I'm one of the community members. I am this, but the Zone Committee is a mixture of people. It's the Saoa Water Zone Committee is a joint committee of Selwyn District Council, Christchurch City Council and Environment Canterbury. More importantly, it's a mixture of people who operate under the Canterbury Water Management Strategy, which was put in place in the late 1990s and then formally came through the Canterbury Mayoral Forum in 2009. It's a partnership of Environment Canterbury, District and City Councils and Ngāi Tahu. And there's four important pillars to the work that happens through the Canterbury Water Management Strategy. It's really easy just to think about the environmental pillar, but actually environmental, cultural, social and economic. And they all are interlinked and we can't separate them. And while it's often unpalatable to talk about those four together, actually we have to keep talking about all four of them together. So prior to my time on the Zone Committee, a dedicated group of people on behalf of all of us worked through in terms of what were the challenges in the catchment, what were the things that needed to be dealt with, what were the values that were really important, and what were the trade-offs that might be tolerable to achieve the greater goals that we have in front of us. And that took a period of a couple of years, quite a lot longer than was initially anticipated at the beginning of that project. But nevertheless, the Zone Committee at the time got to a point where they handed ECAN staff an intent that was then worked through the whole RMA process and is now what we call Plan Change 1. So tonight in this sixth series, we're going to talk about farming within limits, farming within those limits that were set through that process. So I hope that as background helps clarify for all of you, all of us, why we are talking about farming within limits tonight. So, although I've just said that and then I've crossed it out and I've said actually I want to talk about food for thought. I want to offer some alternative thoughts to you to think about as we are operating in this zone within some limits, and how do we think and progress forward within those. Now, we could discuss lots of science and share lots of good examples, and we'll provide some of those tonight. But primarily want to talk about the principles of food production, because actually that's what it's about. You see, it's really all about people and food. There's a Māori proverb that says, what is the most important thing in the world? It is people, it is people, it is people. And I put up there a typical family farming team. Mum and dad, a couple of staff. There's a whole lot of people involved in this whole operation that we call dairying, and that we easily say, those dairy farmers, they should, or those farmers if only. Actually, they're you and me. They're just like you and me. They're people. They're people who passionately get up and do what they love doing. They're passionately investing in their businesses, in their environment, looking after what they know best, trying to find the best compromise between all the challenges and opportunities in front of them. And they're passionately producing high quality food, whether it's cereals, whether it's through sheep and meat or milk or some combination. They're out there producing our food. Some of you will have heard of Tom Vilsack, the former US Secretary of Agriculture. He made some statements that I'd encourage you to go and listen to if you haven't heard him speak before. But he says quite pertinently, every one of us that is not a farmer because we have farmers. We delegate the responsibility of feeding our families to a relatively small percentage of this country. He goes on and expands that line of thinking. It's quite fascinating when you step back and listen to what he says and thinks about its implication for us. He says, you and I have the choice to do the things we want to do, to be the people we want to be, all because we don't have to worry about producing our food. We don't have to worry about how our food is produced. We go to the supermarket and buy it. So think about that, please, when you think about what we're asking farmers to do. We're part of this together. We're part of this food production system, and every choice we make at the supermarket or at the veggie shop all have an impact on the environment that we live in. Why do I talk about principles? Well, practices change constantly. Today's best practice becomes tomorrow's good practice, common practice. Before long, we're looking at those things through the eyes of history. And in the words of Professor Keith Woodford, we're saying, actually, that was pretty quaint. So we need to think more about the principles of what is going on within our catchment, within how we choose to shop within our environment, because that is what will enable us to make the changes that we're all seeking to make. Let me give you a couple more examples in that same vein. Cycle helmets or airbags. You know, in principle, we all want to be safe when we're travelling. In principle, we all care about getting to our destination in one piece and in the time we desire. And most of us would probably agree that wearing a bike helmet today is what you do when you go cycling. But it's not that long ago, it was rare to see cyclists wearing helmets. It's a change in practice that's gone from best practice to common practice. And when we think about airbags, they were invented way back in the 1970s, but weren't common practice until they became dominant in new cars in the early 2000s. So while in principle, we all want to keep ourselves and our families safe while travelling, in reality it's taken a long time for some of those practices to become common practice. So while it's easy for us to ask farmers or builders or any other segment of the community to adhere to best practice, in reality there's many examples where we, together, you and I, our community, with hindsight, we've been slow to adopt good practice. And so that's why I want us to focus for a little while tonight on some of those principles of farming and local food production. What are some of those principles that come to mind for me? Well, we operate in a biological system. We've got a lot of things going on within our local environment, within our local food production system. Soils, plants, animals, all interacting together, all influencing one another. And it takes time to implement some of the changes that we might want to. If we want to change the genetics of our dairy cows or our sheep population, it'll take 2 or 3 generations of those animals to make the kind of changes we might seek to do. We all need and want to be efficient with our resources. As much as possible, we want to avoid losses. And where we can't avoid losses, we need to minimise them. And all that happens while we're dealing with multiple uncertainties. Climate, markets, regulation. It's all changing. It's all uncertain what it will be in the future. But we make choices today around what we know with those uncertainties and how we can best manage them. I want to touch on a couple of things that get a lot of focus, rightly or wrongly, when we start talking about the environment and our impact as society on that. The first is nitrogen, the second is water. Because these two things are part of the biological processes of our environment, biological processes that interact with the impacts that we now see. So soil nitrogen. Did you know that in the top soil, the top 150 millimetres of soil, there's anything from 2,000 to 12,000 kilograms of nitrogen in that soil? Most of that is not plant available. Most of it's what soil scientists talk about as being in the organic pool. But there's a small portion of that migrates from that organic pool into the plant available pool. And that's going on whether we're engaging with it through farming, through cultivation, through horticultural practices or not. That is going on. There's a lot of nitrogen in our environment. So we need to be mindful that we live in a nitrogen-rich environment. If we look at that in terms of in a grazed pasture, look more specifically at what's going on in grazed pastoral systems. We take a local irrigated pasture growing well, producing, say, around 20,000 kilograms of dry matter per hectare. That's going to be taking up something like 600 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year. But there's probably only a third to half of that nitrogen that is purchased in the gate by the farmer. The rest is recycled naturally through dung and urine in a grazed system. Some of it's through mineralisation of that organic pool. There's a whole lot of recycling going on. We're not bringing in all of the nitrogen required in our system. We rely on the biology, on the soil system, to actually provide most of the nutrients that we require. Melissa Robson put the slide in front of you earlier in the seminar series when she talked about water quality. And what she was referring to in the slide is that there's a whole lot of time lags going on in some of the things that we care about. She put up all these headlines and symbols of things that have happened historically and commented that some of the nitrogen that we now see coming through the system is nitrogen that was in the farming part of the cycle back 40 to 60 years ago. So some of the things that are going on, we might have a view of today's practices, but there's some long time lags. And so we shouldn't always judge today's practices by what we see out in all of the outcomes. And fortunately, we've learnt a lot in the last 40 to 60 years. We've made a lot of progress in that time. What about soil moisture? There's a lot of information in this graph here, but let me just point a couple of things out to you. That line there is what we call field capacity, and that one there, refill point. And effectively, between those 2 points is where our plant will optimally grow. If it's above field capacity, our soil is saturated, and we won't get the productivity that we could or should. If it's below refill point, we're too dry. It's too hard for that plant to grow well. So what we can do now with technology is we can monitor that soil moisture. We can monitor the amount of available moisture in our soil. Of course, as we get irrigation or rainfall, soil moisture goes up. As we get drainage or plant uptake, soil moisture goes down. But with this data, with this knowledge, we can make smart irrigation decisions that minimise drainage and maximise plant growth. And so modern technology can relay that information back to our farm office, back to our mobile phone, so that we can schedule our irrigation based on plant requirements, not gut feel. So there's another principle there. Combining science and technology is resulting in much more efficient practices and better environmental outcomes. I have confidence that science will continue to get us into a better place. Let me give you an example of that. Here's 2 cars. They look pretty similar. 2 Toyota Corollas as it happens. One was made in 2004, the other in 2014. Same size engine, pretty much same power output. But in 10 years, science has given 14% more fuel efficiency in those 2 cars. So that same science is going on every year in our soils, plants, animal systems within agri-food production. And that same science approach will give us incremental gain that over time adds up to something quite significant. Some of the ideas that lead to these changes come from farmers themselves and are validated by science. Some of it comes out of scientists thinking in different ways about how we can operate. But nevertheless, new science, new research continues to develop more efficient farming systems. An example closer to home, Lincoln University Dairy Farm. Through my role at CITIC, we have the pleasure of operating this farm on behalf of the university as a demonstration farm for the industry, for the community, to show what can be achieved. And it's a farm that we take great pride in. It's a farm that the industry takes a lot of notice of. Here's our objective for this farm. We set this back in 2011. Our objective is to maximise sustainable profit. But our objective is to do that thinking about the whole farm system, thinking about all of the hectares that are involved with our farming operation, thinking about the total environmental impact that we have with that business, and making sure that while we seek to maximise profitability, we want to do it without increasing our total environmental footprint. And as you see, we put some other caveats or voluntary constraints around that as well. And I would like you to note, this doesn't happen overnight. We had planted and fenced this stream way back in the early stages of the farm. But it's quite nice to see all that in practice. So the farm is what we call a pasture-based farm. We're endeavouring to match a relatively constant animal demand with a variable pasture supply. Now you can rightly look at that dotted line there and say, well, that line doesn't look too variable to me. That's what happens when you graph stuff on a monthly basis. It's actually a zigzag line there. And significantly, we've got periods of time here and here where we don't have enough pasture growth to meet our cow demand. And we can't tell our cows, sorry girls, nothing to eat today, see you tomorrow. What we're trying to do in pastoral agriculture is balance that animal demand with the ability of pasture to grow through a seasonal pasture curve. I put up an annual indication of total nitrogen required earlier, but let's look at it on a monthly basis. The big block there is the total nitrogen required on this farm on a monthly basis to grow the feed required to feed our cows. But the yellow or orange box at the bottom is the amount of nitrogen fertiliser we put on to drive that pasture production. So we're managing our system to supply all the rest of that nitrogen. We're looking to recycle that nitrogen as much as possible. And it is our soil, plant, animal interaction that enables us to produce high yields of pasture with a relatively small amount of that total nitrogen supplied by ourselves and the rest managed through that whole process. What about the impact of this farm? Well, overseer is a phrase that many of you have heard of. Ask me afterwards if you'd like some more detail on overseer, but it's a way of measuring, or I should say modelling the likely nitrogen loss from any particular piece of farmland, most useful in a grazed system and a livestock-based system. And so what we have here is the nitrogen loss modelled through overseer for this farm for the last 8 or 9 years. And what you see initially on the left here is our nitrogen loss has started increasing through this period of time in spite of our objective to maximise profit within our historical environmental footprint. We started seeing a lift in our environmental footprint and our nitrogen losses. We weren't happy with that, and coincidentally the Land and Water Plan came along and said it's not a good thing. So we had to make some changes. This year, 2013-14, we met our environmental target, but at a significant cost, at a cost of $84,000 to this business. So you can argue, was that okay? I wasn't happy with it. I was comfortable, if that's the right word, to ask the university permission to run at a loss for 1 year, but I certainly wasn't going to do that year after year. So we then set about saying, how do we maximise our sustainable profit within the kind of nitrogen loss that is going to be tolerable and acceptable and show what we can do with this farm? How do we get these kind of levels of nitrogen loss rather than this nitrogen loss that we had experienced? And I will just point out for those of you that are interested in the detail, we did have some other things going on in here that was mitigating that loss. That's off the table now, so we work with what's available. So since 2014-15, we've implemented some research that came out of a joint industry government funded program that's enabled the farm to largely restore its former profitability and do that while reducing nitrogen losses below its baseline, which is what the Land and Water Plan required us to do. Fortunately, we've also reduced greenhouse gas emissions because it's very easy in these discussions to get singularly focused on one topic. Actually, we've got a whole lot of measures that we want to improve our farm output on. So importantly, total losses across the catchment are now lower and profitability has largely been maintained. This here is showing you milk production in the top graph and nitrogen fertiliser on the bottom graph. The changes we've implemented over that time have largely maintained milk production per hectare. That's really important because it's that milk production that creates income for the farm, and income offsets costs which inevitably continue to rise. But significantly, we've learnt with this farm how to operate, how to produce the same amount of milk with about half the amount of imported silage and about half the amount of nitrogen fertiliser. And you see that on the lower graph. So we've maintained our milk production up at those kind of levels there, with a level of nitrogen across the season that's roughly half what it used to be. But we didn't know we could do that before we embarked on the journey. We didn't know we could do that before the science had been done, the research that gave us confidence to make it work. So profitability is now largely maintained with a smaller footprint. Profitability enables the farm to pay its staff, its suppliers, maintain the on-farm resources and the future productivity, and reinvest in aspects like native planting for biodiversity benefits. So the question becomes, well, where next? Let's say, to keep it simple, this is where we are now. We have some impact. We create some benefits. Okay? You can put your own metrics on what you think those numbers or values should be. But we sit in the system with creating an impact, but creating some benefits as well. Where do we head to next? Well, some would say, I'm not interested in the benefits. I want the impact as small as possible. You should be down here. But why shouldn't we be aiming up here? Why shouldn't we be saying, how do we minimise our losses further and maximise the benefits? There's a lot of things going on that I think enables us to get into that top left-hand corner. Genetics, in terms of the cows, the type of cows that we operate, is showing some real benefit, some real opportunity in terms of what's being phrased low nitrogen sires. There's a lot of work around alternative forages and how we might integrate those into our grazed systems. Some farms are looking at hybrid standoff facilities. Others are looking at how to combine grazing and low nitrogen supplements. There's lots and lots of work going on. For others, it's how do we work together to treat losses and minimise the impact on the rest of the environment. And there's always more work around irrigation efficiency. There's lots of things going on, and that's just a snapshot of how we might get back up here and keep all of the benefits. I talked about alternative forages. Let me just give you a little glimpse of what that might mean. If our standard pastoral system is creating this much nitrogen loss and a standard ryegrass white clover pasture, but we go to an Italian plantain mixture, we've dropped our losses from there down to there or down to there. That's a really significant change, and that's happening. And one of the things that excites me about seeing this is quite early research. This is kind of beta stuff, if you use that language in terms of other technologies. But the great thing about our industry is we see opportunities like this, the science gets known, gets talked about, and farmers pick up on it. And they say, well, if Italian ryegrass and plantain can have that kind of benefit, I wonder how I could pull that into my system. I wonder how I could integrate some plantain next time I'm resowing my pastures. I wonder how I could integrate a much more Italian ryegrass plantain dominant pasture sward. And we've got farmers out there actively working out how to do this before the science and the research has been completed, and that will help inform how to actually put it in place. So, as an industry, we continue to evolve and adapt, and we'll continue to evolve and adapt. You don't see many of us milking our cows by hand anymore. Increasingly, there is interest in robotic dairy farming and robotic milking, and that top right-hand picture is a robotic milking unit. There's a few of them around in Canterbury. Whether it's robotics milking cows or robotics doing other parts of our farm operation, we're going to see more of that. What I like is that we have found a way of harnessing our pasture really well, and this is what we tend to think of and like to think of in terms of our grazed pastoral system, in terms of how our food, your milk, your cheese is produced. Will it be that way in the future? Well, you and I are going to make that decision. Farmers will evolve to what they need to. They will operate within what they have to. What we want to make sure is that we've got the right signal coming through, we've got the right information to make the right decisions. Together we'll work out what that needs to be. So I want to come back to this. You and I have the choice to be whoever we want to do what we want to do, all because we don't have to worry about growing food for our families. There's many paths to the future. Together we have to get engaged in the conversation. Together we have to make this work. So with that, I'd like to hand over to David, a local farmer and also involved on the board of Foundation for Arable Research, to talk about some of these things from his perspective. Welcome, David.
I'm an arable farmer out at Leaston. And out at Leaston, we crop 180 hectares there, have been irrigating for now 46 years. And over those years, we've seen quite a change in the cropping system. So just to give a bit of background, I'd like to sort of give you an idea of what a cropping system farm looks like now compared to what it was potentially 20 to 30 years ago. So previously, the cropping system was more of a true mixed cropping system in Canterbury, which incorporated livestock as well as a cropping program. And what we've seen over the years has been a change to operations which are more based on one or the other. So quite often the cropping rotation will be all around crops with some livestock in the system only on seasonal occasions during the season. So they may be there during the winter and spring period. What that's meant to the cropping operation is that we have a larger number of crops in the rotation. So that rotation previously on a full mixed cropping system may have been one or two, possibly three different types of crops. Because the whole crop farm is now in cropping, you'll now see up to 8, 10, even 12 crops in that rotation. And that's actually a really good thing because it gives us some variation, it gives us a range of biodiversity across the farm as well, and it also allows us to deal with issues such as we're seeing coming around with resistance. The other thing that we farming at Leaston is we actually farm in a community. So I farm in the Ellesmere community. It's been a farming community for 150 years, still is, and it will be in 150 more years. And that's really important because that community part of it, belonging to a community as a farmer is vitally important, and it gives you ownership and is very important that you can feed into the community, and the community has the ability to hopefully feed back to you as farmers. So what does farming within limits mean? There's three main areas, and Ron went through what the plan change means to us. But there's three parts which affects us in the farming program. The first part is the farm environment plan. Each industry organisation has worked with their growers to develop templates, which makes it a lot easier for the growers to put these templates together and develop their own farm plans. And I think these farm plans are actually a great asset for any farmer. The problem with farming is that you don't have the time to often sit down and look at your business, look at the reasons why you're doing things and the reasons and the areas that you want to improve in. And that's what the farm environment plan does. It is actually a way of putting down on paper in a plan what you actually do and the reasons why you do it and the outcomes that you expect from those actions. It also allows you to aim and put in some long and short-term goals that you want to achieve on the farm, and they need to align with what's coming through within the plan changes. So you can work out the timeframes in which you think you can make changes on your operation and set those timeframes into the plan. The other thing is that it's a living document. It's not something that you develop and throw away in the back of the office and don't look at it again. It's something that should really be looked at once every 6 months or at least once a year, and make sure that you're on track of what your plan is going forward. The second area has been consents. So a number of farms within the zone will need to get consents over the next 6 to 12 months. And there's a number of reasons why you'll get caught up in needing to get those consents. The first one is if you're greater than 15 kgs loss of nitrogen from the root zone. And this means that you need to get your consent in, applications done, and with those consents you have some conditions which you need to farm under for in order to achieve that. Those losses also need to have some reductions. So obviously to bring the load down in the zone, we need to see some reductions by 2022, and they have been devised for each sector, with the dairy sector, for example, needing a 30% reduction and the arable sector needing a 7% reduction. One of the other areas where you may get caught up requiring a consent is the cultural landscape value management areas, and these are the areas around the fringes of Lake Ellesmere, as well as the edges along the lowland streams, which obviously are the spring-fed streams flowing into the lake. And these are to make sure that practices that are in those areas are consistent with good management practices and that will have as little impact on the receiving environment, mainly the lake, as possible. One of the other reasons why you may be caught up is you may be in a phosphate or sediment risk area. This is one which has been a little bit contentious in that it doesn't actually line up with the science. The science is different than the reason why this has been brought in. And personally, I would have been far more, it would have been better if simply a decision was made that those in the lake zone watershed immediately above the lake would need a consent, rather than using phosphate as a reason, because it simply doesn't line up with the science of how phosphate is lost. And the third area which we're going to do is around the farm environment plans and auditing and grading of those farm environment plans. So once we have a farm environment plan in place and you have a consent in place, within the first year you need to have that audited. And these are by registered auditors who have been through training, and they will look at what you've got on your plan, look around the farm, see if you're up to grade and that you've achieved what you've said you're going to achieve in the timeframes. And they will be graded with grades from A to D. And that's good. It's actually the first thing that I've seen that's come out which actually says there are farmers who are doing a good job and there are farmers who are not doing a good job. And I'll talk about incentivising a little bit later on. Good management practices. These have been developed with the ECAN along with all the industry bodies, and to make sure that we know what each industry should be achieving as a good management practice for their sectors. And there's a number of areas there which are important, particularly for cropping. And the number one area for us is around nutrient matching. And that means that we need to understand the plant demands and the nutrient demands of those crops, but more importantly, when those plant demand timings are coming on. If we can understand the timings, we can drip feed those nutrients to the plants at the right time so that there is no excess in the system, which then could be lost into the environment. Minimising fertiliser applications during high-risk times. We're actually able to manage our crops in a way so that we can, instead of having nutrient applications in the early part of spring, we can manage crops in a way that pushes those back 2 or 3 weeks and takes those nitrogen applications to a point in time which there's far less risk of it being lost to the environment. A couple of examples of matching those nutrients. Ryegrass for seed is a crop which is grown commonly in Canterbury, and it's the seed which is the grass which is then taken up through to the seed stage and harvested. And previously it was common knowledge or accepted that approximately 300 kgs of nitrogen to the hectare was what was required to take that seed crop through to get the maximum results out of it. But work by FAR, along with international collaboration in Denmark as well as Oregon, and interestingly enough, doesn't matter where you are in the world, all 3 countries came to the same figures, that number now only needs to be around 130 to 140, plus mineral N, which is stored in the soil. So we're seeing a reduction there of at least 50%, if not 60%, from what was standard practice only 10 to 15 years ago. So there's significant gains being made, but that gains wouldn't have been made without the scientific research being done. One other interesting area of research which came out around nutrients was that a dryland crop actually needs 7 kgs of nitrogen per tonne more than an irrigated crop. And you're probably wondering why that reason is, and it's simply the ability to give the plant the ability to grow to its maximum potential. So if we're looking at a 10-tonne crop, dryland or irrigated, when we put on irrigated crop, we know that we can achieve the 10 tonne because we can put the water on and the plant will utilise all the nutrients which we have put on. In a dryland situation, because we have no control over the plant growth, that excess that went on but wasn't uptaken by the plant because it got too dry simply sits in the soil until the autumn, when it's once again at risk of being lost. Rotations of our crops has become very important, always has been very important, but we're learning a huge amount about the biology of rotations. But one of the key areas around rotations is utilising the residual N that sits in our crops, sits in our soils, particularly after pulse crops such as legumes such as pulses, which is peas, and white clovers. Considerable amounts of N can be stored in the soil during those crops, so it's important that we use crops, deep-rooted crops such as wheats and maises, to make sure we mop up any of the nutrient which has gone past the root zone of our shallow-rooted crops. So those deep-rooted crops, they can grow a metre and a half root depth from an autumn sowing, which in Canterbury is generally most of the soil profile. Obviously there's some biological and some disease benefits from the rotation as well. Soil management. Obviously it's one of the key things as a farmer, and most farmers are pretty crucial at making sure that they're doing a good job and looking after it. The main aim there is to make sure we're improving the structure of the soil as well as the carbon content. Why do we do this? Two reasons are the big reasons. One, we can increase the water holding capacity of the soil, which means less irrigation is needed. But more importantly for me is that we can actually increase the cation exchange capacity of soil, which means that soil will hold on to more nutrient than it would previously. How do we do this? How do we improve the structure and increase carbon into our soils? One which has been internationally a big change has been around reduced tillage. So we all know that excess tillage destroys the structure of the soil. So reduced tillage or even direct drilling has become very common. The use of cover crops and also leaving residues on the surface is another area which maintains two roles it maintains. One around maintaining some cover on the surface of the soil so that the soil is protected from heavy rainfall events and also wind erosion. But also with cover crops, it's making sure that something is growing in that soil most of the time, so that any nutrients that are there are able to be captured and then recycled when that crop is put back into the ground. One change we've seen, because we've gone from a mixed farming system to a more of a true cropping system, is that we don't have as long restorative phases or the grass phase in our system. So it's key that we maximise, when we do have grass in our system, that we maximise that as long as we can. So quite often a grass seed crop may be only down for 1 year. So if we can, we'll try and take that through for at least 18 months, and then if we can, we'll try and direct drill so that we're not losing the carbon that we've gained from that restorative phase, simply in the next application of the next crop. Riparian plantings obviously have a role in the way we manage our soil to stop it from removing off the soil, off the paddocks and into the drains. But my preferred option there is that the best way to manage your soil is actually managing it in the middle of the paddock. Once you've got soil moving to the margins, you've actually lost the battle. So the best management is actually managing it as a whole paddock and managing the soils properly throughout the paddock. And one other change which is happening at the moment is quite a shift to biological systems within cropping, and it's becoming certainly more common in the mainstream, and I think it will continue to. So utilising organic materials, biological systems that are utilising that carbon pool which Ron talked about earlier more effectively. One of the other areas there is irrigation management. Obviously having efficient equipment is one of the key areas there, and that doesn't mean that it needs to be 100%, which is impossible to achieve. But we do need to be mindful that while linears and pivot irrigators make a really good job, sometimes the landscape that you're operating in dictates to the type of irrigation systems that you can operate. So there needs to be flexibility around those type of systems. Knowing the water holding capacity of different soils, as Ron had before, he had a graph up there with the water holding capacity, full capacity point of that soil. But that soil capacity changes across a paddock. There's variations across the paddock. And understanding what parts of your paddock actually have a lower or higher water holding capacity is also very important. The monitoring of water, of the moisture levels, is highly important. As Ron had mentioned, if you don't know what the moisture potential is of the soil, you can quite easily put too much on or not enough, and you lose production or you lose water out of the system. There's a number of ways in which you can monitor soil moisture. You know, there's the technology out there which can deliver it to your phone, but quite often it doesn't have to be that complicated. You know, the crushing soil in your hand and wherever it sticks in a ball is actually surprisingly accurate. But as long as you're understanding what it is and where your soil is in that phase. The issue with irrigation, there's been a lot of talk about irrigation and the damages that does. It's not actually the irrigation that does the damage, it's the way in which it's operated and the management of irrigation. So good irrigation systems will actually be beneficial for the environment, but they need to be managed really well, and that's a key important part. And the other thing with irrigation management in a cropping system is that you get one crop a year, and 3 or 4 days in the wrong point with poor management or not being able to keep that demand up quite often will be the determining factor of the result of that crop. So it's while it takes a year to grow, it may only take 2 or 3 days of getting your management wrong to affect the end result. The other area, which isn't up there but is around precision agriculture, and that really is around knowledge of management to me. It's about gathering a whole lot of information and knowing how to use it. And obviously the industry bodies are helping to understand what those areas are and how best to utilise them. Other areas are electromagnetic maps of your soil, and once again, as I talked about, we may have areas in each paddock which is quite different to other parts of the paddock and need to be managed in a different way, in the amount of water that it can receive, but also maybe the amount of nutrients and the potential plant growth demand for that area. So there's no point in aiming for the top crop on the part of the paddock which can achieve it when 2/3 of the paddock simply won't be able to achieve that yield. Variable rates applications, and this can be a range of things. This can be from fertiliser to sprays as well as variable rate irrigation. And that's once again matching the ability of the soils to take those nutrients, water or chemicals in and matching them up to what can be handled within those soils. Because we're harvesting our crops, we can also do yield maps from the combine. And once again, they are very interesting to look at areas which are performing well and which aren't performing well. And as a general rule of thumb, we've found that the soil type is the biggest determining factor. So managing those soil types is crucial. And one other area is zone testing. So previously we may have looked at one paddock and done a soil test across the paddock and said that's what all that paddock is. It's 6 pH, or it's got Olsen P of 20. But in fact it may have had a range of pH from 5.4 to 6.5, and it may have had an Olsen P from 10 to 35. So doing zone testing and normally 1 hectare grids allows you to look at the variation in the paddock and try and balance that up. And quite often it is, one, it's better for the environment, but two, you actually find that it's normally economical way of doing it as well. So what are the issues that we do have in the cropping system? We know that every farming system has issues. There's a couple, I think, and the one part that complicates it for us, as I've just spoken about, the plant side of the system, we can match the demands. We know when those demands are going to be coming on, and we can deliver the demands to them. When we add a livestock component in there as well, it complicates things a little bit in that we have distribution of urine and stock intensity which aren't always even. So we're strip grazing, and that does add changes to the system, meaning that we can't. Is that still going? Yep. And so yeah, just the way in we distribute those nutrients which are recycling through changes. But to me, one of the big concerns is what do we do about the tail? So up there's a simple standard deviation graph. And the problem is, we know that we've got most people in here, we've got the good guys up the top here, and it's this tail down the bottom end here. I think it's probably in the arable industry, probably only 5%, but they're ones who are probably not doing the best, they're not probably trying hard enough or aware of I don't think it's an issue of not being aware, I think it's probably a matter of actually doing the right thing. So how do we address this? And I think that some examples probably have to be made. We've got to a point here with the environment that we need to actually make some gains and make some points that if you aren't going to work within the good management practices that the industries have agreed to, then there is some consequences. Obviously, with a curve like this, the main aim is to keep moving it up. So we want to keep moving that graph all the way to the left if possible. So there's two ways in which you can, when you've got a mean graph like this, there's two ways. You can either incentivise or you need to prosecute those ones at the bottom end. And at the moment, I think we're seeing ECAN probably sitting in the middle, not doing either. And personally, I'd like to see one way or the other to drive this forward. So where to from now? I think we've got to make sure that we keep our eye on the end goal. We've got to have policies that make sure they address the problems and not just policies which are there simply to work around the edges and beautify things. We know what the problems are. We've got a lake issue, we've got stream issues, and the solutions need to be there which actually address those nutrient problems. Farmers are normally pretty pragmatic about the problems and they normally come up with solutions reasonably well. And I think some more dialogue between the way in which planners are working and with farmers to make sure that the plans that are put in place are practical and can align with the solutions that quite often farmers have come up with would be vitally important. The other area is around a discussion on how do we get this out in the public. And at the moment, the publicity that we're seeing is really around that tail. It's those bottom 5% which are getting all the publicity. And there's a lot of good stories out there, but we can't get them across. So there's a piece which ECAN worked on with ECAN around the consenting process, in which the press got a hold of it, removed all the parts of the story which were the good stories around the farming work that had been done, also removed the component around rural pollution and printed it. So when you're in a situation like that where you can't actually get your good stories across, it's pretty difficult when you've got maybe 90% of the farmers doing a good job, but it's still being persecuted because of a 5% at the bottom end. As a rural community, we acknowledge that there are issues there and we want to make sure we find those solutions. And obviously those issues occur in the urban community as well. And I think it'd be good if there's recognition from both sides that the issues are there. Quite often they're common issues and there may even be common solutions. It does take time. On our farm, we've spent 20 years travelling down a line of soil health, and it was 7 years before we saw any great gains. And it will be the same with this situation here. We can't expect to have solutions that are going to work overnight. It's going to take time, but we need to be looking once again at that long-term goal. Also in our community, we were about 15 years ago, because of all the issues we've had around water initially, but now farming in general, we started a local group. It was initially an Ellesmere Irrigation Society, but now it's called the Ellesmere Sustainable Agriculture Incorporated Society. And it's been a great vehicle for us to be able to deliver to the community and give farmers ability to work with ECAN as a group rather than as individuals, which is far easier for ECAN, but also far easier for us to manage. And that's been very successful, I think. And I think it's got more work to do. It's probably a vehicle we can use to probably bridge some of the urban-rural issues. One area I think that if we want to push the government on, there is a big hole in nitrogen research. There's still a lack of understanding around nitrification and the ability to model it accurately. It's a big piece of work, it's very complicated, but I think if we could press the government to try and achieve that, there would be some big gains for the environment right across farming within New Zealand. And while this session has been called Farming Within Limits, I'd just like to say that farmers have limits as well, particularly in our zone. Our zone's had a fairly hard time. The guys at the bottom end have copped a lot of slack. Have copped a lot of issues around the streams, the water flows, the nutrient, and quite often it's a cumulative effect. And some of those farmers are getting pretty weary, to be honest. And so I just want to say that, you know, farmers do have limits, and to make this thing work, we actually need to have the cooperation of farmers. And if we lost that, then we would be in deep trouble. So I think we need to recognise that we can push so far, but if we lose that cooperation, then we don't actually have anything to work with. And thank you for attending and listening.